Hello and welcome to this lesson on how to create a Spring Boot project in Spring Tool Suite IDE. So we're going to use STS Eclipse. This STS Eclipse is nothing but Eclipse IDE pre-bundled with all the plugins needed to support tooling for developing Spring Boot based applications. By now, I hope you have already downloaded and set up this STS Eclipse IDE. So let's see how to create a Spring Boot based project in STS Eclipse. Now, this is your Eclipse workbench in STS. To create a Spring Boot based project, go to the File menu, go to New, and in File New, you can see an option for Spring Starter Project. So STS refers to it as starter projects because it is based on something known as starter kits provided by Spring Boot. So select this option, Spring Starter Project. Now, once you select this, now at this screen, you can see there is something called service URL. This is nothing but the web service behind the scenes to which your IDE would connect to generate an empty project based on your setting. This URL is URL already provided by Spring Community. Do not change this URL. Leave it as it is. Some of you who may be making use of VPNs might get an error at this stage related to network connectivity. I would suggest try doing this by turning off the VPN when you're creating the project. Right, so then comes the name of the project. So I'm going to call it Customer App. So as you see, as I type the name, that also becomes the artifact ID. So this will also become your project name. And this is going to be a project based on Maven, packaged into a jar ultimately. I'm going to change the version of Java to 8. We're using version Java 8 for everything. So Java version 8, change it to 8. The language is Java, not Kotlin or Groovy or some other JVM-based language. It's going to be Java. And then we have the Maven coordinates. What should be the group ID, what should be the artifact, and what should be the version of our project. So since this is a Maven project, we are going to supply some values for group ID, artifact ID, and version. This group ID is usually based on the Java package naming convention. So I'm going to use home.training as the group ID. And the artifact ID, I will leave it as customer app. Version, I wouldn't change it from whatever the version that is offered. And the package name, this is important. So I'm going to change the name of the package to com.training. So, which means this will be considered our base package in a Spring Boot application. As we shall see, this base package is important concept. All the other layers are expected to be found inside this base package. So be careful with the typographic errors and supply the package name to be something like com.training. So once I supply these values, I'm going to click Next. And at this screen, this wizard is asking me, what are the technologies that you're going to use in this project so that it can get all the necessary libraries. These are called as the different starter kits. As of now, I'll not select anything because selecting many of them would lead to errors if you do not correctly configure the necessary configuration properties. And to begin with, we're going to use Spring Boot only for doing dependency injection. So therefore, I'm not going to choose any of these technologies just yet. And then click Next and then click Finish, and it should create a Spring Boot based project for us called Customer App. That was the name that I supplied. So in the right hand bottom corner, you can see there is this progress bar running, and In my case, this should take a few minutes to complete. Probably if you're doing it for the very first time, it may take several minutes to complete. So this is the created project. So now if I expand this project, you can see that this project is a Mavenized project. It follows the Maven directory structure. src main Java for the application code, src main resources for the configuration files, src test Java for the test cases. And then you have the pom.xml file, the Maven project object model XML, which sets up a parent tag with Spring Boot start parent, which means our project kind of inherits from Spring Boot supplied POM. And as of now, we have two dependencies. One is on a starter kit called Spring Boot Starter that gets you all the libraries needed to use or to make very basic use of Spring. Plus, there's another dependency on a starter called Spring Boot Starter Test, which gets you all the libraries needed to develop test cases and to test Spring Boot applications. So I'm going to leave this POM as it is, not make any change. And if you now go to src main Java, you should see that it would have also created a class with a main method which just tries to launch Spring Boot. And this application class is also annotated with @SpringBootApplication. So we haven't written any code in yet, but I just want to ensure that this code runs. So you can just right click run as Spring Boot application, and the Spring splash screen should come up and the application should then get terminated. So that's how you create a simple Spring Boot based project. Now, in the subsequent lessons, we will build on this project.